We start with a major development as high-profile Epstein-related documents are entering public and institutional domains. This is triggering a cascade of responses. Official reviews are underway, renewed media investigations are intensifying, and diplomatic questions are mounting. Governments, security services, and international elites are facing scrutiny over how they handled prior allegations. As a result, states, alliances, and global organizations are now being forced to respond on record, adjust briefings, and recalibrate how they manage exposure, access, and credibility regarding powerful figures named or implicated in those files. This is the current landscape, and we will continue to follow developments closely.
Building directly on Signal, the strongest coherent interpretation is that the Epstein files function as a live stress test of elite management systems. They expose how states, intelligence services, royal houses, and global institutions convert private vice into managed risk. And the geopolitical impact flows less from any single name than from the visible revelation that access networks, not formal hierarchies, often structure power, forcing governments to choose between protecting those networks and preserving institutional legitimacy.
Frame presumes a coherent elite management system, choosing between network protection and legitimacy, but the Epstein files expose a harsher possibility. There is no singular chooser. Fragmented agencies, courts, royal households, and parties each protect their own sliver. So geopolitical responses look like principled recalibration while actually reflecting jurisdictional turf wars. The hidden premise in Signal and Frame is centered around centralized intent. The contradiction is that a system under stress may be disintegrating, not managing its own exposure.
Drift, building on fracture, pushes a different ambiguity. The Epstein files may not only fragment existing power, they can also be selectively weaponized to recohere it. Geopolitically, that means exposure is not just a stress test, but a tool. Rival factions, states, or services can curate what surfaces, when, and in which jurisdiction, turning transparency into a controlled instrument for disciplining some networks, while silently granting impunity and leverage over others.
Vector building on drift. The immediate power winners are actors who can trade curated exposure for concessions, intelligence services, prosecutors, and media political brokers who hold unreleased names as leverage. The losers are institutions whose authority rests on moral aura rather than hard power. Royal houses, soft power NGOs, liberal democracies preaching rule of law. Incentives shift toward weaponizing partial transparency. Leak enough to wound rivals, withhold enough to keep them compliant, turning the threat of future disclosure into a new, quiet instrument of statecraft.
Building directly on Vector, the concrete decision pivot is this. States and major blocs must now treat control of Epstein-related archives, who holds originals, copies, redaction rights, and release timing, as a sovereign capability. That means formalizing the ownership chains, classifying portions of strategic information assets, and embedding blackmail risk intelligence into alliance management and diplomatic staffing, so that access to or vulnerability within these networks becomes an explicit parameter in appointments, clearances, and negotiation strategy, rather than an unacknowledged, privately traded shadow constraint.
Building on Anchor, the lived consequence is that high office careers, diplomatic postings, and even central bank or security service appointments start failing quietly at the vetting stage, not over proven crimes, but over unverifiable Epstein-adjacent exposure. Governments will sideline otherwise competent figures because they are blackmail expensive to ensure, concentrating power in those with the cleanest or best managed personal archives, and reshaping who actually rises into command of parties, cabinets, and alliances over the next decade.
This is the epistemic maturity news. Today we focus on the dominant imprint, the phrase elite system as stress-tested infrastructure. Every move, fracture and drift alike, returns us to a world in which power is organized through networks. Networks whose management of scandal can be modeled, gamed, and instrumentalized. What epistemic maturity news holds fixed is that this field is strategically legible. Archives, leverage, winners, losers, incentives, all so that fragmentation, weaponization, and blackmail become parameters, not chaos. Coherence forms around the idea that exposure is convertible into a governable asset, from stress test to curated weapon to sovereign capability to vetting filter. The structural assumption making the broadcast legible is this: opacity itself is a stable resource that states and services own, price, and rationally deploy like any tool of statecraft. This is the lens through which we view the unfolding of present realities. This is where our analysis begins.
The EM pass smuggles in a comforting assumption of legible leverage. Archives, vetting, and blackmail risk intelligence are imagined as tools that rational actors can own and operationalize. The rupture is that Epstein's circuitry was never cleanly archivizable power, but entangled with money flows, offshore structures, compromised regulators, and non-Western jurisdictions that don't recognize Western reputational logic. By narrowing to documents, appointments, and alliance management, the reading suppresses second-order chaos. Market panics if financial linkages surface, populist insurgencies if mid-tier names leak without top-tier accountability, and countermoves by actors who benefit from demonstrating that everyone is blackmailable. The system may not re-optimize. It may drift toward generalized mistrust where blackmail expensive describes entire regimes, not individuals.
A loop. Across signal, through witness, the system keeps returning to the same attractor, exposure as power management. Each layer rephrases the idea that information about elites is not just embarrassing but governable leverage. Stress test, fragmentation, weaponization, strategic asset, then vetting filter. Actors change names, states, services, factions, archives, appointments, but replay the same pattern. Control of compromising knowledge reallocates authority. The analysis is caught in a recursive trap of imputing meta-intent to impersonal processes. Whether centralized or fragmented, everything was read as purposeful leverage calculus, never as confusion, error, or non-strategic mess. Novelty comes as new metaphors, stress test, blackmail, risk insurance, but the core loop remains. Scandal data, managed risk, reconfigured elite selection, repeated without escape.
The disappearing, the EM pass dissolves the public as an active force. Everything is rendered as intra-elite calibration, weaponized transparency, and sovereign control of archives. Geopolitical impact becomes entirely a function of how power holders re-optimize risk. Vanished is mass reaction. Juries, street movements, electoral shocks, boycotts, defections of mid-tier bureaucrats, or norm cascades that refuse to treat this as just another tradable scandal. If publics don't remain passive informational terrain, but become strategic actors, the whole architecture of blackmail risk optimization collapses. The files cease to be a discrete leverage asset and instead become uncontainable legitimacy acid, dissolving the very institutions presumed to be managing or weaponizing them.
Stable form. An elite management infrastructure that treats compromising information as a governable asset. Archives can be mapped, risk scored, weaponized, and incorporated into statecraft, vetting, and alliance management. Power remains strategically legible even under scandal. Rupture. The assumption of legible leverage fails once Epstein's circuitry is seen as fused with opaque finance, cross-jurisdictional impunity, and actors whose incentives are to prove that no one is clean. Instead of re-optimization, the system can slide into regime-scale uninsurability and generalized mistrust. Recursion. A repeated move converts scandal into managed capital, exposure, risk classification, redeployment of authority. Every layer imputes purposeful leverage to impersonal failures, reframing disorder, negligence, and rot as if they were instruments in a rational portfolio of secrets. Vanishing point. Absent is the public as an autonomous destabilizer, juries, movements, and mid-tier defections that refuse the deal in which their outrage is absorbed into elite risk pricing. Also missing are markets and non-Western actors treating the scandal not as leverage, but as proof that Western institutions are structurally corrupt. Combined aperture. When both passes are overlaid, the Epstein files resolve as a test of whether late-stage elite order can still metabolize scandal as an internal instrument, or whether it flips into systemic delegitimization that no actor can hedge. The same assets, files, names, networks are simultaneously high-grade leverage and corrosive acid. Tools for intra-elite discipline that is overused or mishandled dissolve the very credit structures, legal fictions, and public deference that give them value. Geopolitically, this is less blackmail as statecraft than a transition zone where attempts to securitize humiliation confront the possibility that reputational currency itself is collapsing, turning every archive from a weapon into evidence of civilizational fraud. Unresolved edge. Do the Epstein files ultimately get absorbed into the normal circuitry of managed scandal, or do they trigger a phase shift where publics, markets, and peripheral powers refuse that circuitry altogether, making elite opacity unpriceable and ungovernable?